He says that will be 100 rupees. What was that? Bakshishling. To go inside. 100 rupees it is. Pay him now. Oh, sure. I fumbled a few notes from my pocket, peeled off 100 rupees and handed it over. There's a special sleight of hand that's peculiar to policemen. The conjuring trick that palms and conceals banknotes with a skill that experienced shell game swindlers envy. The big man collected the money with a two-handed handshake, smeared a palm across his chest as if brushing away crumbs after eating a sandwich, and then scratched at his nose with practiced innocence. The money had vanished. He pointed along the narrow corridor. We were free to enter. 2 sharp turns and a dozen paces beyond the gate and its shaft of bright light, we came upon a kind of courtyard. Several men sat on rough wooden benches or stood in talking groups of 2 or 3. Some were Arabs, dressed in loose cotton robes and kafiyehs. An Indian boy moved among them, serving black tea in long glasses. Some of the men looked at Prabhakar and me with frowning curiosity. When Prabhakar smiled widely and waved a greeting, they turned away, concentrating their attention once more on their conversation. Occasionally, one or another of them looked up to inspect a group of children who sat together on a long wooden bench beneath a ragged canvas awning. It was darker there after the bright light of the entrance chamber. A patchwork of canvas scraps provided an uneven cover that screened out most of the sky. Blank brown and magenta walls rose up all around us. The few windows I could see, through tears in the canvas coverings, were boarded over. Not a real courtyard. The roughly square space seemed unplanned, a kind of mistake, an almost forgotten architectural accident formed by building and rebuilding on the ruins of other structures within the congested block. The ground was paved with haphazard collections of tiles that had once been the floors of kitchens and bathrooms. 2 naked bulbs, strange fruit on the withered vines of bare wires, provided the poor light. We moved to a quiet corner, accepted tea when it was offered, and sipped it in silence for a while. Then, speaking quietly and slowly, Prabhakar told me about the place he called the People Market. The children sitting beneath the tattered canopy were slaves. They'd come from the cyclone in West Bengal, the drought in Orissa, the cholera epidemic in Haryana, the secessionist fighting in Punjab. Sourced in calamity, recruited and purchased by scouts, the children had journeyed to Bombay by train, often alone, through all the many hundreds of kilometers. The men gathered in the courtyard were purchasers or agents. Although they seemed to express no great interest, talking amongst themselves and for the most part ignoring the children on the wooden bench, Prabhakar assured me that a restrained haggling was taking place and that bargains were being struck even as we watched. The children were thin, vulnerable and small. 2 of them sat with their 4 hands bunched together in a beehive ball. One child embraced another within the huddle of a protective arm. All of them stared out at the well-fed, well-clothed purchasers and agents, following every change of expression or emphatic gesture of their bejeweled hands. And the eyes of those children were like the black gleam at the bottom of a Sweetwater well. What does it take to harden a man's heart? How could I see that place, look at those children, and not put a stop to it? Why didn't I contact the authorities? Why didn't I get a gun and put a stop to it myself? The answer to that, like the answers to all the big questions, came in many parts. I was a wanted man, a hunted criminal living on the run. Contacting police or government authorities wasn't an option for me. I was a stranger in that strange land. It wasn't my country, and it wasn't my culture. I had to know more. I had to know the language that was spoken at the very least before I could presume to interfere. And I learned the hard way that sometimes, even with the purest intentions, we make things worse when we do our best to make things better. If I came back with a gun and stopped the slave market there, in that crooked concrete maze, it would start up again somewhere else. Stranger that I was, I knew that much. And maybe the new slave market in a different place would be worse. I was helpless to stop it, and I knew it. What I didn't know then, and what troubled me for a long time after that day of the slaves, was how I could be there and look at the children and not be crushed by it. I realized much later that a part of the answer lay in the Australian prison and the men I'd met there. Some of those men, too many of them, were serving their 4th or 5th prison sentences. Many of them had begun their imprisonment in reform schools, boys' homes they were called, and youth training centers, when they were no older than those Indian slave children. Some of them had been beaten, starved, and locked in solitary confinement. Some of them, too many of them, had been sexually abused. Ask any man with a long enough experience of prisons, and he'll tell you that all it takes to harden a man's heart is a system of justice. And strange and shameful as it is to admit it, I was glad that something, someone, some experience had flinted my heart. That hard stone within my chest was all that protected me from those first sounds and images of Prabhaka's dark tour of the city. Hands clapped in brittle echoes, and a little girl stood up from the bench to sing and dance. It was a love song from a popular Hindi movie. I heard it many times, hundreds of times, during the following years, and it always reminded me of that child, 10 years old, and her surprisingly strong, high, thin voice. She swayed her hips, pushing up her non-existent breasts in a child's imitation of a temptress burlesque, and new interest quirked the heads of the purchasers and agents. Prabhaka played the Virgil. His soft voice was ceaseless, explaining all that we saw and all that he knew. He told me that the children would have died if they hadn't found their way to the people market. Professional recruiters, known as talent scouts, roamed from one catastrophe to another, from drought to earthquake to flood. Starving parents, who'd already watched one or more of their children sicken and die, blessed the scouts, kneeling to touch their feet. They begged them to buy a son or a daughter, so that at least that one child would live. The boys on sale there were destined to work as camel jockeys in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Gulf states. Some would be maimed in the camel races that provided afternoon entertainment for the rich sheikhs, Prabhaka said. Some would die. The survivors, grown too tall to ride in the races, were often abandoned to fend for themselves. The girls would work in households throughout the Middle East. Some of them would be used for sex. But they were alive, Prabhaka said, those boys and girls. They were the lucky ones. For every child who passed through the people market, there were 100 others or more who'd starved in unutterable agonies and were dead. The starving, the dead, the slaves. And through it all, the purr and rustle of Prabhaka's voice. There's a truth that's deeper than experience. It's beyond what we see, or even what we feel. It's an order of truth that separates the profound from the merely clever, and the reality from the perception. We're helpless usually in the face of it, and the cost of knowing it, like the cost of knowing love, is sometimes greater than any heart would willingly pay. It doesn't always help us to love the world, but it does prevent us from hating the world. And the only way to know that truth is to share it from heart to heart, just as Prabhaka told it to me, just as I'm telling it to you now.